Now, we've already studied 2 Peter, which has quite a few commonalities with the letter of Jude. They were probably written around the same time. It's not necessary that they were, but probably were. And one writer probably wrote first, and the other writer used the first as a resource because there are things that are very, very close. Again, all of the writings in the New Testament and Old alike are inspired by the Spirit. So, which is going to come into play later in our lesson this morning about a resource that Jude uses that is a little different. So we'll talk about that briefly in a while. So we don't know whether they wrote the same time. Perhaps they sat down at a table together and wrote both of these together to different audiences. We don't know. One could have been a few years, maybe many years before the other. And then the second writer used that first letter as a resource maybe to expand or talking to a different audience, which we'll talk about in a minute. I think there probably was. We don't know for certain. The letters don't say, to the church at. We don't have that. These are general epistles to the church at large, but they could have been focused on particular congregations or an area of congregations. So some of the things we find as commonalities between the two letters are part of what we're studying today. So today there are, in verses 5, 6, and 7, Jude uses 3 examples of those that were unfaithful, rejected God, and received condemnation and judgment for it. Okay? And the reason for that he brings up these 3, is that back in verse 4, there were those that crept in and were teaching or practicing, espousing these other beliefs, which is unbelief to the one true and living God, to the gospel. And so he is emphasizing that there is a price to pay. There is a cost for your unbelief, and it is going to come at the judgment. So your belief, and specifically in this case, appears to be the lewdness, the sexual immorality that is going on in the congregations that Jude is writing to, or the church as a whole in various areas. And we know that to be true because of a lot of Paul's letters. He covered many times sexual immorality. What is apparently happening here to the audience that Jude is writing to is that those that are practicing such things are laying claim to the grace of God, that they can conduct themselves as such and it not be detrimental to their souls, that they won't be held to account for it, that those physical things done in the body are not going to damage their spiritual health, their spiritual condition. And that, of course, is not true, and there will be a price to pay, as these 3 verses say. So, again, comparing Jude and 2 Peter, both of them use as examples Sodom and Gomorrah and angels. Okay? They differ in that Jude uses the children of Israel as the third example, and Peter uses the flood. Okay, so there's where they differ. You might ask, why did the second writer not just use the first three and add a fourth? Changed it up a little bit. Well, the commentators surmise that Jude's letter is probably written more to a Jewish audience, Jewish churches composed of the Hebrews that accepted the gospel, obeyed the gospel. Whereas Peter's might be more of a worldly audience, one that has Gentiles predominantly in them. So in that case, it might make sense for Jude to write about the children of Israel and Peter to write about the flood, which covered the world. That's supposition. We don't know. They don't tell who their audience is or why they're writing that way, but that's a possibility. There are some things that are very clear. In verse 4 of Jude, it talks about denying the Master and the Lord Jesus Christ. That we find that in 2 Peter 2:1. False teachers' condemnation from the past. Again in verse 4 in Jude, and 2:3 in 2 Peter. They despise authority or slander celestial beings in verse 8 of Jude, chapter 2, verse 10 in 2 Peter. Angels do not bring reviling or railing judgment, 9 in Jude, 2:11 in Peter. Again, false teachers are mentioned again in verse 12 and 2 Peter 2:13. There's some verbiage, some terminology, style, where Peter talks about springs without water and mist driven by a storm in 2:17. Jude writes clouds without water carried along by winds, very similar in verse 12. And then following their own lust or their own ungodly lust, 2 Peter 3:3 and Jude 18. So there's a number of things that are very, very close between the two. All right. We've already compared 2 Peter. I'm going to go ahead and read that just so we'll have that in mind. In fact, I'm going to read a little bit more than what I've got on my notes. 2 Peter chapter 2, we're going to start with verse 4. For God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly. And delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked, for that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. And verse 9, then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of the temptations and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. So a lot of similarities between our text today and 2 Peter chapter 2, 4 through 9. All right, so verse 5, Jude, verse 5, but I want to remind you, though you once knew this. So there is a reminder. We find that also in 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, also in chapter 3 and verse 1. 1 John 2 and 21 uses that same language, reminding. And Paul in Romans 15, 14, and 15 talks about reminding. What is the term of remind infer? What is it based on? You've known it, you've heard it, you've learned it, you accept it, but perhaps it's not at the forefront of your mind and the way you're living today, so it's needed that you are reminded of these things because they have a bearing on what's going on in your life today. So that is what Jude and Peter does in 2 Peter, is to remind them of these things that have heard. They have heard. Now, for Jude, if he is indeed writing to the Jews, to Hebrews, they would never forget the being saved out of the land of Egypt and then end up wandering for 40 years before being allowed to enter into the promised land. We'll cover that a little bit in just a moment as we look at Numbers 14. Okay, so it's a well-known event in Israel's history, but perhaps others are not quite as aware of it. Maybe they've heard stories, but it's not quite ingrained in their upbringing. So the reminding may be even more important. In fact, it probably stirred conversation. So let's say Gentiles heard, listened to this letter being read, and they're going, tell me more about the children of Israel and what they did. And if they had access to the book of Numbers in the first century, which would have been in the synagogues to some extent. Not every synagogue had every writing, so you might have to find it, but you could read out of the Pentateuch, what we call the part we call today the book of Numbers. So it's a well-known event in Israel's in their history. God saves them by bringing them out of the land of Egypt. But because of their unbelief in a number of different ways, do they all get to go into the promised land? No. Some do, right? But not all. Those that were 20 years or older did not get to go into the promised land. So 40 years later, they would have been 60. That means all of them died, except Joshua and Caleb, by the time they were 60 years old and did not get to enter into the promised land. Those that were under 20 were excluded from that restriction, and they were able to enter into the promised land. So let's go to Numbers 14 for just a moment. I'm playing this by ear because I don't know how deep to go and still be able to cover all the material. But Numbers 14, the whole chapter is about this. The basis of it's actually chapter 13, where the spies went into the land. Caleb stands up and says, we can take the land. 10 of the spies say, no, it's too imposing, it's too difficult, we can't do it. And Joshua later, not in chapter 13, but later, he is added to Caleb as being faithful as he takes over for Moses. But in chapter 14, so Israel rebels against God in the first 10 verses there. And then Moses intercedes. And he he petitions God for leniency. And then we find, beginning in verse 20, then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice, they certainly shall not see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. So God draws a line. Those that were unfaithful, that didn't have the necessary faith, the belief in God that he, mighty God, would help them acquire the land, to conquer the land. They didn't have the proper faith. They, in fact, if we went back and looked at the details, what did they really want to do? Go back to Egypt, didn't they? They lacked the necessary faith. So because of that, God drew a line that they, who should have been faithful, would not receive the promise. What was the covenant all along? If I am your God, you will be my people. Basically, if you are faithful to me and obey me, I promise you these things. For the Jews coming out of Egypt, there was a promised land for them to acquire. It was already theirs. All they had to go in, had to do was to go in and possess it. But they lacked that faith. And so there is a consequence for that. So they're going to wander in the wilderness. I want to, just for time's sake, I want to jump ahead to verse 35 there. I, the Lord, have spoken this. I will surely do to all this evil congregation who are gathered together against me in this wilderness. They shall be consumed, and there they shall die. There is a consequence to their unbelief. They are going to die without receiving the promise. Okay? So that is what Jude is writing about there in verse 5. But I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. So their failing was unbelief. We can get confirmation of that if we turn to Hebrews chapter 3. And if we look at verses 7 through 19, see if we read all of that. Actually, 7 through 11, there is a recitation of Psalm, the 95th Psalm. So let's just start with verse 12. Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God, but exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sins. For we have become partakers of Christ, and we hold in the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. And I probably should have read 7 through 11 because that's talking about their time in the wilderness. There in verse 8, in the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works 40 years. Therefore I was angry with that generation. So the result of that, follows in beginning with verse 12. In 16, for who having heard rebelled, indeed was it not all who came out of Egypt led by Moses? Now with whom was he angry 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose corpses fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who did not obey? So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. So Hebrews has a confirmation of what we saw in the book of Numbers. We could look at Deuteronomy chapter 1 as well, but we'll pass on that this time. So, they certainly had unbelief about possessing the lands, but they had other things they had issue. They were constantly complaining, weren't they? They rejected God a number of times. They wanted to go back to Egypt, put themselves back into slavery under the rule of Pharaoh and how he abused them. They thought that better than a little bit of difficulty when they needed more faith to trust in God. So they rejected God, they complained about God, and this is an example of that. God will destroy those who refuse to believe. The reason is a lack of obedience and the unbelief that we've talked about. So clearly the issue is unbelief. It will result in judgment. In fact, if you go, I didn't write this down, but if we were to go to Revelation verses 21, verse 8, but the cowards, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Unbelieving is specifically mentioned there as failing in the judgment. So again, why is Jude bringing this up? Because there are those that are among them that have this unbelief. They're not believing in the Lord God, the Lord Jesus Christ. As we've talked about in other lessons, I'm not sure about in Jude. It certainly was in Peter's case. There were those that didn't believe in the incarnation of Christ on the earth, that it was spirit-based. So they had false beliefs, which was unbelief, insufficient belief to be obedient to God. And it would cost them their souls. Before we move to angels, any thoughts, questions on the children of Israel? I was tempted to take these out of order and do Sodom and Gomorrah next, because it's pretty straightforward. The angel piece you can chase rabbits on that, but we're not going to do that today, are we? Okay. Angels. Verse 6. Got to get back to Jude. And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Boy, that just begs questions, doesn't it? It's just, what is going on here? And the angels who did not keep their proper domain. What angels are you talking about? Do we really need to know? Inquiring minds want to know, but do we really need to know? So let's go back to 2 Peter, and what does he say about the angels? 2 Peter 2. Okay. Verse 4. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, so the angels sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. So really the only added information we have there, Jude says, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain. Peter says the angels who sinned. Okay? So, when you go start looking at commentators, you get some wild stuff out there. But most likely, what this is referring to is Genesis chapter 6, the first 4 verses. Okay? And we'll talk about why, but let's look at that first. Genesis 6. By the way, neither Peter nor Jude give any reason for this, right? The readers, the hearers, evidently knew what this was about, or more explanation would have been necessary. I'm not an angel. Why does that apply to me? Genesis 6, the first 4 verses. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Okay. How do we get from Jude and Peter to Genesis 6, 1 through 4? Okay. The readers, the hearers, evidently had some idea, so it would have been something that was available to them. Was it just stories handed down from generation to generation? Perhaps. But there is other information available. Are you familiar with the book of Enoch? The uninspired book. It's part of the Apocrypha. Okay? So Enoch, it's a very long book. You remember who Enoch is. In chapter 5 of Genesis, he's the great-grandfather, right? The great-grandfather of Noah. The 7th from Adam. The book is attributed to him. We don't know because it was probably written in 100 years before Jesus, and it comes in several parts, and some of it is not believed to have been written until 100 years after Jesus. So it took a period of time, and it was all put together, but they attribute it to Enoch. Remember Enoch, who walked with God, who did not die, he was taken. It's attributed to him. It's uninspired, okay? But we're going to go on a little bit of a diversion here. Look at verse 14 and 15. Jude 14 and 15. I'm stepping on somebody's toes here, but I need this to make a point. Okay? I'm not sure who's got 14. Maybe it's me. I don't know. Maybe I'm stepping on my own toes. Mike, do you have this? It goes, it is Billy. He's got 11 through 16, so Billy can correct anything that I'm saying wrong when he gets to the lesson. But look at 14 and 15 briefly. Now Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about these men also, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them, of all their ungodly deeds which they have committed in an ungodly way, and all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Okay? That's 14 and 15 in Jude, which is inspired. All right? The Word of God is inspired. Let me read from you Enoch chapter 1 and verse 9. And behold, he cometh with 10,000 of his holy ones, to execute judgment upon all, and to destroy all the ungodly, and to convict all flesh of all the works of their ungodliness which they have ungodly committed, and of all the hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Does that sound familiar? Jude used Enoch chapter 1 and verse 9 in his writings. Would the Holy Spirit have allowed him to do it if it wasn't accurate of any use? Okay? Now that's unrelated to verse 6 about angels, but what it does say is that there is some elements of truth in that uninspired letter that became oral tradition over the years, and the people knew about it. Okay? So we take that one step further. In chapter 6 of Enoch, and it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters, and the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And then it goes into a lot of names. There were evidently 200 of these, and there were a group of them that were the leaders of that. Okay? According to Enoch, an uninspired book. That is not in the New Testament. But it's part of the book of Enoch, which perhaps was known by the population in the first century when Jude is writing this letter. So the supposition is that Peter, when it says they sinned, Jude, when he says they left their proper domain, is talking about these angels who left their proper domain, their heavenly home, and came to earth and took women, human women, as their wives. Okay? We don't have anything in black and white in the New Testament of an inspired account that says that's correct, but it makes some sense. Okay? The other is the other primary and maybe even more common belief, which we are not going to get into today, okay, is about fallen angels. And there are a number of passages that, other than these specific angels in Genesis 6, and sometimes combining that with Satan, which, again, we're not, if Billy wants to cover that one day, that might be interesting, but I'm not sure how edifying it would be. Okay, do you follow my train of thought on that? Am I way out of bounds? We don't know. Peter and Jude do not say this is the reason angels sinned and fell, or sinned and left their proper abode. Okay, we don't have that. Get back to my notes in the right place. Okay. So what we do have in the text is that they left their proper domain. The King James says estate, left their estate. The ESV says their proper dwelling. I think the New American Standard says domain. And then the second part of that, left their own abode. They failed to keep their proper domain, but left their own abode. There, the New American Standard says proper dwelling place. ESV says position of authority, which is a little bit different in those. So, we don't know the circumstances for sure, but we know that the angels rejected God and left him, left their proper abode with God. They rejected God. That is a sin. Whether you're an angel or a human being, if you reject God, that is a sin. God is not going to save those who don't want to be saved, that reject him. And it's mystifying to me that angels would do that because they were in the presence of God. Hard to understand. But they wanted what they wanted, right? They wanted the human women. Okay, so their sin, they did what they should not have done. They reject God, and the result of that is there is a consequence, isn't there? He has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of that great day. They are going to be judged. They are bound, and they are going to be judged just like men. There is a consequence to their rejection of God. So, Christians who Jude is writing to, if you don't believe in God and you reject him, his teaching, his gospel, there is a consequence. You will be judged for it. Right? That's the purpose of those. And then finally, we get to verse 7. As Sodom and Gomorrah, you notice I didn't ask you for any questions on the angels there. Verse 7, as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. And Peter, go back to that again. I should have bookmarked that. So 2 Peter 2, verse 6. And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly. Very similar language there. So, we know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Won't take, we're not going to have the time to cover it today, but we know that we got a couple minutes. Let's go there. Genesis 19. And 19:1, it starts right out. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate. That's back in 18 was about Sarah and Abraham and their faith and those visitors that they had. And then now the two angels come to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he arose to meet them and bowed himself with his face toward the ground. And he gives them hospitality there. And then in verse 5, the residents there, and they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them carnally," or know them. Carnally's in italics. But Sodom is a homosexual city. They have a lot of homosexual residents, and they wanted access to those, what they believed to be two men, which were really angels, okay? And of course, there's been many lessons taught on that. We don't have time to do all of that today, but Lot refuses, and he tries to save his family, gets his two daughters and his wife, and they leave. Mrs. Lot has regret and is turned to a pillar of salt, and it's just Lot and his two daughters from that point forward. What happens to Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities? Not all of them, but most of them. They're destroyed. Because they were immoral. Now, did they know God? In the time of Abraham and Lot, what was the method of worship back then? It was the patriarchal system, right? So you perform sacrifices just like Cain and Abel, like Abel, not Cain. You performed sacrifices and you worshiped God. It was delivered by mouth. They didn't have the written word back then, so it was tradition as to how they worshiped God. So it's probable that the residents of Sodom knew that. They knew God, but they wanted to live their life their way. And they paid a price for it. So again, summarize that. Jude gives 3 examples of what immoral living, unbelief, rejection of God, that it will cost you in the judgment. And so beware of these that have crept in unaware, that are taking advantage, they think, of the grace of God and living how they want to live, lewdly. Okay? We're out of time. I kind of got there. So thank you all.